Chapter 6. Doug talked little on the way to church, and Trudy's attempts to get him to speak fell on deaf ears. "Did you have blood on your shirt this morning?" she asked. She wanted to know if it was animal blood or human blood, but she wasn't sure she'd be able to get the information from him. He'd been so quiet lately, it was starting to make her think she was doing something wrong, but she had no clue what it could be. He shrugged, not ever looking at her. She had no idea what on earth she'd done that was so wrong, but she was determined not to let his attitude hurt her at all. Instead, she'd go to his church and meet as many people as she could. She didn't know anyone in the area yet, but she wanted to. She needed to make some friends to make up for the sisters she was missing so desperately. When they pulled up in front of the church, he quickly handed her down, and she took the pot she was carrying inside the church, letting Mrs. Goldman show her where to put the pot. Mrs. Goldman led her to the area where all the pots were waiting for them, talking as they walked. "How's married life treating you, dear? Your husband has lost a bit of the hungry look he always has." Trudy laughed. "I'm thankful. I thought cooking for him would be a never-ending job." She finally had time to do a few other things since his appetite was sated for a short while. "Well, I can assure you it's not over yet." Mrs. Goldman smiled. "Let me introduce you to a few of the ladies. I think you'll enjoy meeting Mrs. March a great deal, because she lives close to you. Perhaps the two of you could spend some time getting to know one another." "Oh, I'd like that so much." For the most part, Trudy's only friends had been her sisters. She'd made a friend at work, and a couple on the train on the way there, but no one had ever spent time with her when they weren't required to except her sisters. Her reputation had been bad enough that it was hard for other women to be around her. "Let's go meet her then." Mrs. Goldman took Trudy's arm and led her over to a woman sitting quietly in a pew, waiting for church to start. "Mrs. March? I want you to meet Trudy Charleston, Douglas Charleston's new wife. Trudy, this is Marion March. Mr. and Mrs. Charleston are your closest neighbors." Trudy smiled, offering her hand to the other woman to shake. "It's so good to meet you. I hope we'll be friends." Mrs. Goldman added, "Mrs. March and her husband just moved here from back east. They'd been here for a few weeks." Trudy sat down beside the other woman. "It's nice to know I'm not the only newcomer to the area." Mrs. March was probably a little bit younger than she was, and there were no clinging children, but she asked anyway. "Do you have any children?" Mrs. March shook her head. "Thomas and I only married 3 weeks ago. I only married 4 days ago. Sounds like we have a lot in common. How would you feel about coming over for tea one day this week?" Trudy hoped she didn't sound desperate when she asked, but she really wanted some time with other women. Mrs. March bit her lip. "I'd love to, but I'm afraid it's too far to walk, and I don't know how to drive." Trudy shrugged. "I could come to you if that would be better." Mrs. March looked around as if she was trying to hide something. "I can't do that either." "I could bring the refreshments and the tea," Trudy said. "Would you?" Mrs. March looked as if she wanted to get together, but there was something holding her back. If it was the refreshments, Trudy could easily take care of them. "I'll have my husband point out your house, and I'll do that." "What day is good for you?" Trudy asked, wanting to get the ball rolling on the new friendship. "Is tomorrow too soon?" Mrs. March asked. "Not at all. I'll happily come tomorrow. Say 2 or 2:30? Either would work for me. Then I'll set out to be there at 2, and if I get lost, it'll be 2:30. Trudy grinned at the other women, determined they would be friendly if not bosom friends. "That truly sounds lovely." "To me too." Trudy got to her feet as the pastor stepped up to the pulpit. "I had better find Doug." She rushed away, finding her husband standing quietly at the back of the church in a group of men. All the men around him were talking, and he was just standing there as if he had nothing to say, which seemed strange to Trudy. He'd done nothing but tease her for the first 3 days they knew one another. As soon as the service was over, all of the women were handing Doug small plates with their meal on it. After a moment, Trudy frowned. "Doug, you should try my chicken and dumplings. I promise, they'll put all the other dishes to shame." The women who were crowded around him all seemed to think they had a hold on him. Trudy needed to show him she was the only person who had a hold on Doug. Doug accepted her chicken and dumplings with a nod, and took a bite. He grinned. "My wife is right, ladies. I've never tasted anything quite this delicious." At his words, the other women wandered away, and Trudy was left alone with Doug. "It feels strange to see so many other women vying for your attention." He smiled. "Sorry about that. It's something we've done for a long time. I don't really know how to put a stop to it." "I can see that." Finally, he'd said something to her, so perhaps everything was about to change. Once they arrived home, Doug went to change clothes immediately. "Need to work," was all he said as he headed out. Trudy sighed. He was obviously back to being silent Doug. She'd had such high hopes for them spending a day together. Just after he left, she heard a wagon pull into the yard, and she hoped it was someone there to talk to her. She was going to go nuts if she was lacking conversation all the time, and Doug didn't seem to care about speaking at all anymore. She hurried to the door and spotted Mr. and Mrs. March getting out of their wagon. At least Trudy assumed it was Mr. March. He'd sat with Mrs. March at church, so he must be. "Come in. It's good to have guests." Trudy called to the couple. "Is Doug inside?" Mr. March asked. "No, he just rode out that way," Trudy said, pointing in the direction her husband had gone. "I'll borrow a horse and follow," Mr. March said. Trudy shrugged, assuming the men had things to talk about. "Come in, Mrs. March. I'll make some tea." "I'd like that," the other woman said softly. Once they were inside, and the door was closed, Mrs. March bit her lip again, as if she was considering what needed to be said. "I need your help." Trudy nodded, sitting down as well. "What can I do?" "I can't cook. Thomas is getting angrier and angrier when I burn the food, but I don't know how to do anything else. I saw that everyone gobbled up your food at the potluck, and I enjoyed what I tried as well. So, I'm here to beg you to teach me to cook. Thomas suggested it after trying your chicken and dumplings." Trudy smiled. "I will teach you to cook happily. What do you know how to make now?" Mrs. March shrugged. "Nothing. I have been feeding my husband beef jerky and crackers for 3 meals a day, and he's told me that has to end. He's not happy with me right now, and I really don't know what else to do." "Well, we'll take care of that then. I'll come over tomorrow as soon as I've finished the breakfast dishes, and we'll cook together." "You don't mind?" Mrs. March seemed nervous to even ask. "You don't even know me. We're neighbors. I'm happy to help you." "Do you sew?" Trudy asked, thinking that if her friend could help her sew, then she might feel better about the cooking lessons. "I can. It was the one thing I learned growing up. You see, my father had a great deal of money, and I only went to the most exclusive schools. He died a year ago, and we still had servants for a while after. Thomas met me at church, and he thought I would be a good wife, because I was pretty." Mrs. March sighed. "I have no idea how to do anything womanly, but sew. We'll learn the rest together." Trudy went to take the kettle off the stove. "You can boil water?" Mrs. March shook her head. "I'm hopeless, aren't I?" "You're not. We'll work together, and you'll help me make supper tonight." Trudy was confident in her teaching abilities. She'd taught some of her younger sisters to cook, and she'd even taught someone at the diner. "I will?" Mrs. March looked skeptical. "You will. We'll have breakfast for supper, and then you can cook breakfast in the morning without me there." Trudy poured tea for them both, and then she served a slice of the raspberry pie she'd made for supper. "You and Mr. March will stay for supper, of course." Mrs. March smiled, her face practically lighting up the room. "We would love to." The two women spent the afternoon talking and learning. Trudy showed Mrs. March how to use a knife. "What you want to do with fried potatoes is to cut the potatoes into chunks. It's easier if you start with leftover potatoes, in my opinion." "Well, I don't know how to make potatoes at all, so how will I know how to make them leftover?" Mrs. March seemed terribly frustrated with her lack of knowledge. Trudy laughed, showing Mrs. March how to properly peel a potato, cut it into smaller pieces, and then boil it. "Now when they're done and cooled, we'll chop them into small pieces. I almost always cook more than I need so that I'll have enough to cut up and make for another meal." "That makes a lot of sense." Mrs. March paid rapt attention to each thing Trudy explained. "How do you like your eggs?" Trudy asked. Mrs. March frowned. "I usually like them soft in the middle, but with the egg whites hard. I'll eat them any way that I can cook them, though." "What's easiest?" "And those are the hardest eggs to make, of course. I'll show you how, and you'll make them for supper tonight. But we're going to practice first, so that your husband thinks you are wonderful for cooking for him. No more mistakes that he can see." Mrs. March laughed. "I hope I can learn all of these domestic chores quickly. I feel like I'm lacking." "You're not lacking. I grew up on a farm, so I had to learn these things whether I wanted to or not." Trudy carefully showed her new friend how to heat up a pan, fry bacon, and then how to use the bacon fat to cook the eggs. She messed up more than a dozen eggs, and Trudy was glad she had so many for her friend to practice with. When Mrs. March made her first egg by herself, she squealed and hugged Trudy. "I made an egg and it has no shells, and I didn't mess up the yolk. I told you it was possible." Trudy also showed her how to cut pieces of bread to make toast. "I'll show you how to bake bread tomorrow. Don't worry about that yet. And we'll write everything down, so that you can just follow the instructions on your own. I'm so glad you moved here. I thought my husband was destined to be angry with me about how little I could do in the kitchen. I was getting desperate as I tried to please him. Soon he'll be begging for his favorite dishes, and you'll know how to make them. We'll make it work." "Have you put in a kitchen garden?" Mrs. March's eyes widened. "I didn't know I was supposed to." "Yes, you really should, but if you don't get it done this year, then you can do it next year, and just buy canned vegetables this year. They're easier to cook with anyway. Can you show me how to do the wash as well?" Trudy nodded, absolutely thrilled to have a project to work on. She would fill her days and have someone to talk to, whether Doug started talking to her again or not. When the men came in, Trudy was standing to one side as Mrs. March flipped the eggs. The plates were already filled with toast, bacon, and fried potatoes. As soon as the eggs were on, they were put onto the plates and Trudy served the men, and then went back as Mrs. March made more eggs for herself and Trudy. Once they were all seated, Doug said a prayer over the meal. "How much of this did you cook, Marian?" Mr. March asked. "The bread was already made, and Mrs. Charleston and I did the potatoes together, but I could easily make them now that she's shown me. I did the bacon and the eggs myself." There was no little pride in Mrs. March's voice as she answered. "Trudy has consented to teach me to cook." Mr. March smiled at Trudy. "Thank you. I hope you know that this won't be an easy task." Trudy smiled sweetly instead of kicking the man under the table as she wanted to do. "We'll work together, and it will go well." Doug sat eating his meal. "Does that mean you won't be cooking for me for a while?" he asked. "If I go to the March's house after breakfast, do you think you could heat up your own leftovers for lunch?" Trudy asked. It would be an easy task, but she knew Doug was much worse in the kitchen than Mrs. March. He frowned. How long is this going to take? I like having my meal already warmed up when I get home. It saves time. I could make you 2 sandwiches for lunch and wrap them in oilcloth. Then you could take them with you and eat without ever having to come home for lunch. It's only for a week or 2. Trudy hoped it wouldn't be longer than that, because she didn't want Doug upset with her, but she did feel the need to help her friend. She wondered if life would always be a balancing act. He sighed. I suppose that will be all right then. Trudy smiled at Mrs. March, letting her know she wasn't bothered by how gruff Doug had sounded. Learning to cook wasn't easy, and the 2 of them would do it together. After supper, Mrs. March helped with the dishes, and to Trudy's surprise she didn't know she had to have hot water to wash the dishes in. I'll teach you all about housework as well, Trudy said happily. She was thrilled to have a friend to be with while Doug was on the range. Once the Marches had left for the night, Trudy sat down with Doug at the table, picking up her sewing. Thank you for not minding if I help Mrs. March. Doug shrugged. I do mind a little, but I suppose if you needed something she would be here. I'm sure she would. She's going to be a good friend to me. He looked at her for a moment before nodding. Do you have a need to be around people? Absolutely. I grew up with a dozen brothers and sisters. How on earth would I ever get used to the silence of being alone all the time? I'm thrilled to have a neighbor so close, and one who needs to learn something from me. It will be good for both of us to spend time together that way. I'm glad you found a friend then. Have I done something to upset you? Trudy asked. You've been awfully quiet. Doug shrugged. I'm a mostly quiet man. I do my work, and I handle things, but I'm not running around looking for someone to talk to all day. Trudy sighed. I am. It looks like you found someone. Doug looked back down at a stick he was whittling, and paid attention to that instead of his wife. Trudy had no idea how she was going to live with a mostly quiet husband. Where was the man she'd married, who had entertained her so much for 3 days? Chapter 7. Trudy made Doug sandwiches for him, and sent him off to work with a kiss that next morning. He seemed distracted even when he kissed her. She knew something was wrong, but if he wouldn't talk to her about it, there was nothing she could do. As soon as he was gone, she saddled one of the horses and rode over to the March's house. When she'd dismounted, Mrs. March was on the porch smiling. I made breakfast this morning exactly like you showed me. Thomas said it was wonderful. Thank you so much. She was obviously thrilled to have cooked something edible for a change. Trudy smiled. So, let's see what we want to cook next. Do you have any supplies? Mrs. March nodded. We got new supplies for me to burn on Saturday. Thomas said it was surely a waste of time and effort, but I'm glad he bought them. Because now I can learn to cook with them. Trudy nodded, walking into the March house, a bit surprised by how dirty it was. She decided to just be bold and say what needed to be said. Now, I'm here to help you, and I'm going to say whatever needs to be said to do that. All right? Sure. We need to clean before we can cook. The floor and counters are filthy, and so is the table. Has anyone ever showed you how to clean? Trudy rolled up her sleeves in preparation for a big day of work. She loved to work. Mrs. March shook her head, looking embarrassed. Never. I know it's supposed to come naturally to people. No, it's not. You should be taught to do it, and I was. So now we're going to get started, and we're going to clean as much as we can as quickly as we can. When the kitchen is clean, then we will start making bread. Mrs. March nodded. I have a broom and some old cloths. Perfect. Have you ever used a broom? When her friend shook her head, Trudy explained what she was going to do before doing it, and then after demonstrating, she put the broom in her friend's hands. Now you do it. It took them working together a little more than an hour to get the kitchen clean enough that Trudy felt like they could mix up the bread dough. Instead of doing it herself with Mrs. March watching, Trudy sat at the table and told her friend how much of everything to add to the dough, while she wrote down everything that needed to be done. It's best to follow step by step until you get used to making it. Of course, getting used to it won't take long. You'll be making it every day or every other day. When Mrs. March had added everything, Trudy told her how to mix it, and then she showed her how to knead it on the table. They floured it and covered it with a cloth, and then they both washed their hands. "Don't worry about the mess," Trudy said. "We wear aprons when we cook for a reason." "All right. What next?" "If you've been here 3 weeks and no laundry has been done, that needs to be next. I'll tell you right now that laundry is my least favorite weekly chore. I absolutely hate it, but I certainly know how to do it, and I'll teach you. Working with a friend makes tasks so much easier." Mrs. March smiled. "I should do yours for a month after you teach me then. Just to thank you for all the help you're giving me." "No, you shouldn't. You're giving me friendship and someone to be with while my husband is working." By lunchtime, when Mr. March came back, there was bread in the oven and soup on the stove. "I know soup isn't the most refreshing thing in the summer," Trudy told him, but it was the easiest thing to teach her to make right off. "I will never complain as long as the food I'm being served is cooked well." He took a bite and smiled. "This is really good, Marion." "Thank you," Mrs. March said as she took a bite of her own soup, a look of surprise on her face. "This really is good." Trudy laughed. "Of course, it is. Don't act so surprised. And it was easy enough that you could make it again without help, right?" Mrs. March nodded. "I'm sure you're a sorceress, to be able to make me able to cook so quickly." Trudy laughed. "Not a sorceress, but I do love to cook." Hopefully that love is showing through. She felt a little out of place eating with her friend and her husband, but it was the best way to teach her. Halfway through the meal, she got up to check the bread, and then apologized. "I really do need your wife for a moment," she told Mr. March. Mrs. March joined her at the oven, and Trudy pointed out the color of the bread. "That's how we know when it's done. When it's that color of golden brown." Then she reached into the oven, using her apron to shield her hand from the heat, and pulled the loaves out of the oven. "We want to topple the loaves onto a clean cloth to cool." Mr. March stared at the bread. "That looks wonderful." Mrs. March frowned at him. "Well, I made it, so don't be so sure, but I hope it's as good as it looks." "I can't believe I made something that smells so good." After lunch, the two women hung the clothes together, and they got dinner on the stove. Chicken and dumplings is a favorite of mine. It's hearty and easy to make, so that's the first supper I'm teaching you to make. We're making more than the two of you will eat for supper, so you'll have lunch waiting for you in the icebox tomorrow. "So really I only have to cook 2 meals a day?" Mrs. March asked, seeming excited at the prospect. "Most days, that will be enough," Trudy told her. "Now, I want you to keep stirring this every few minutes until supper time. I need to get home and start our supper, or I'd stay and help you." "You've already done so much," Mrs. March said. "Tomorrow, I'm going to show you how to dust and clean your windows. And you'll learn a couple more meals, and maybe how to bake a pie, if you'd like." Trudy had a good day teaching her new friend, and she was glad she'd spent time with her. Getting to know her was making her feel less lonely for her sisters. "I'd love that." Mrs. March smiled. "Thank you, Mrs. Charleston. If we're going to spend this much time together, we need to be on a first-name basis," Trudy said. "I'm Trudy." "I'm Marion, and I can't tell you how pleased I am by your friendship. I think you may have saved my marriage." Trudy left the March's house that afternoon, feeling good about what she'd accomplished that day. Her friend had a lot more to learn, But at least she had some confidence after making a few meals that hadn't burned. When Trudy got home, the house was quiet, and she hurried in and started supper. She'd had beans soaking all day, and she added a touch of ginger to help cut down on the effects of the beans before putting them on to boil. She wasn't sure if the ginger really helped, but she felt like it did. She carefully fried up strips of bacon, and she added the bacon to the pot with the beans in it, washing the extra dishes she used as she went. By the time Doug returned from his day of work, the beans were ready to serve, and she poured them over the rice she'd made in a separate pot. While he washed his hands, she set the food on the table. Looking around, he couldn't see what had been neglected in his house. "When did you get back?" he asked. "About an hour and a half ago." She didn't know how to do laundry or how to even sweep her house. "I showed her so much, and I plan to go back tomorrow, if that's all right with you." Trudy asked, but she would go either way. He didn't need her there during the day. He frowned, but nodded. "That's fine." "Do you not like me going to help her?" she asked. "I feel like my wife should be doing things for me and my home. Not off running around with a friend." Trudy wanted to get angry with him for his answer, but she'd asked the question. "If I'm ever injured or sick and can't work, I'm sure she'll be the first one to come over and help us. She'll have to use the skills I'm teaching her to help. Or what if I have a baby and I'm sick while I'm with child? She'll help. It's what neighbors do for each other." He sighed. "I guess it is. I just want my wife in my home. I'll be in your home as soon as she's able to cook well. I taught her to make chicken and dumplings today." "That's probably good. Your chicken and dumplings are tasty." He took a bite of his beans. "These are good. I wish we had cornbread to go with them, though. I'll remember that the next time I make beans for you then." That was the last of the conversation during their meal. After, he got his whittling out, and she cleaned the kitchen, and then wrote a couple of letters. If he'd wanted to talk, she would have happily sewed, but since he didn't seem to ever want to talk to her again, writing was the answer. Asterisk. The week went by quickly with Trudy going to Marion's every day to teach her more things. Finally, the two of them went for a long walk one afternoon, and Trudy found a cherry tree on her friend's property. She clapped her hands excitedly. "We'll make a cherry pie for dessert tonight." "Well, two of them. Doug is starting to feel neglected with as much time as I'm spending with you." "How are we going to pick them?" Marion asked. She carried a basket over her arm, and when she'd questioned why she needed to, Trudy just smiled. "Give me the basket, and I'll show you." While Marion watched, Trudy quickly climbed the tree and started picking the cherries. "How did you do that?" Marion asked. Trudy shrugged. "I've been climbing trees my whole life." She plucked as many cherries as she could just as quickly as she could. When the basket was full, she carefully dropped it into her friend's hands, and then she shimmied down the tree. "We probably won't have time to make the pies for supper tonight, but we can make them tomorrow." "Oh, that's too bad. I was hoping I could make one for church. Thomas has never let me take any food to the potluck, because he said nothing I made was worth eating." Trudy shook her head. "I should have thought of it earlier in the week." "I'm sorry. It's already Saturday. You could make the fried chicken I showed you for the potluck. Yours turned out very well." Marion pursed her lips and then nodded. "I'll do that. Thank you for the suggestion. It's so hard for me to remember I actually know how to make a few things now." "What will you take to the potluck?" Trudy hadn't thought about that yet, but she needed to. "I have to take something good. All those women gather around Doug, trying to get him to say their food is the best. Did you know he would pay whoever brought the best tasting meal to the potluck? So, all the women are thinking of him when they cook." She shook her head. Marion laughed. "I wondered why the woman gathered around him that way." Trudy sighed. I guess I will make a cornbread casserole. Doug will love it, and so will everyone else. What do you put in it? Marian asked. I have no idea. I'll make it up as I go tonight. I'm thinking some sausage, cornbread, and I have a little cheese I could use. It'll be good, whatever I decide to put in it. Trudy loved experimenting as she cooked. Marian shook her head. I wish I could just throw ingredients together and come up with something delicious. You'll get there. We'll work on that next week. Marian laughed. Sounds good to me. Is Doug working again tomorrow? I think so. Why don't you two come over for supper? We'll make something a little more complicated together. I love chicken pot pie, and that would be fun to make with you. Or maybe I should take that to the potluck. No, invent something for the potluck, because I want to learn to make chicken pot pie. Sounds good to me. When they arrived back at Marian's house, they sat down and worked on pitting the cherries. You know what? I think I'll take a cherry pie to the potluck, Trudy said while they worked on the fruit. She wanted it to be something Doug would love. I think that will go over well, Marian said. As soon as they were done with the cherries, Trudy got to her feet. I need to head home to fix supper. You remember how to make the gravy for your pot roast, right? Marian nodded. I have your instructions written down. I'll let you know tomorrow how it turned out. Sounds good. Trudy went outside, mounted her horse, and headed back to her house. It had been a wonderful week, filled with camaraderie, even though Doug was still acting strangely. She was just glad he wasn't the only person she had to talk to. As soon as she got home, she washed 3 potatoes, poking them and putting them into the oven. And then she put 3 steaks on to fry. She'd eat only one of each, but she knew her husband's appetite. While supper was cooking, she rolled out the dough for her pie crust, getting the pie she would take to the potluck ready, and of course, a second one for Doug to eat most of. She already knew that Doug loved her pies, and that pleased her. She just wished she could please him more. He seemed more distant every day, and she didn't know what was keeping him from talking to her. When he got home, she was just taking the potatoes out of the oven and slipping the pie in. She took the steaks off the stove and put them on plates, added the potatoes, and then she served them both. How was your day? She asked. It was the same thing she asked every day, and the same thing he never really answered for her. It was hard, he said quietly. We lost 3 calves who got wrapped up in some fencing we were building and left out overnight. I'm so sorry. It was the most he'd told her about his work all week. He nodded. Me too. They were all heifers, and we would have kept them to breed next year. I hate that we lost them. He bowed his head and said a prayer over the meal. Is it going to hurt us financially? Trudy asked, thinking of the money she still had stashed away. She was happy to give it to him if he needed it, but for now, it was nice to know she had a nest egg. Not really, because we'll make up for them, but I hate losing a heifer. They're the foundation we build our entire herd on, and having even 3 die is always a blow. She nodded, wishing she had the right words to say to him, but the real problem between them was she never had the right words. Gone were the days when their light-hearted teasing filled the house. Now they were barely talking. They had to get past that. Chapter 8. On their way to church the next day, Trudy kept up a light-hearted chatter about her week and how spending time with Marian had gone. I think she's going to be fine on her own after another week. I hate it though, because I really enjoy spending time with her. Perhaps she could teach Marian to do spring cleaning, and then they could do both houses together. It would be much nicer than working alone. When Doug didn't really respond, she simply kept talking, growing uneasy with the constant silence between them. I made a pie for the potluck today. You know you need to choose my dish as the best there. Uh-huh. Finally, they arrived at the church, and Trudy was happy to be able to escape to go and talk with the other women. One after another, they came to her and introduced themselves. "I didn't expect Doug to marry so soon," one young woman who had introduced herself as Carolyn said. "Why not?" Trudy asked. She genuinely didn't understand the women of that town, all trying to outcook the other for Doug. "He never talks," Carolyn said. "It must have been awful on your wedding day, trying to get him to talk." Trudy shook her head. "Not at all. He talked nonstop for days." "And he had, but then he'd stopped." "Really?" Carolyn asked. Several of the young ladies in town cooked for him and tried to capture his attention, but he didn't speak enough to any of them. No one felt like she'd ever be special to him. Trudy looked over at Doug, who was surrounded by a group of men. Everyone was again talking but him. Was it really possible that Doug just didn't say much? It was hard to believe after their first few days together, but she supposed anything was a possibility. How odd. "I think it's odd if you can get him to speak more than 1 or 2 words at a time," Carolyn said. "Well, I can definitely do that," Trudy said. She thought about the conversation she'd had with him that morning. She'd wanted him to say more, of course, but truly, he'd been downright eloquent compared to what the other women were saying. Maybe she needed to talk about things that interested him more. Food was at the top of the list. Since they'd quit talking about food all the time, he'd quit speaking. Perhaps she could get him to tell her about the orphanage where he'd grown up or about ranching. He obviously had a very deep interest in his ranch. All during the service, Trudy thought about what Carolyn had said. Other women had cooked for him and shown an interest in him, and he hadn't been willing to speak to them? It was crazy. As soon as the service was over and everyone divided up for the potluck, she cut a piece of her cherry pie and took it to Doug. He ignored all of the women with outstretched hands, holding plates toward him, and he took her pie. One bite was all it took. "Sorry, ladies. My wife is the best cook in all of Colorado. You need to stop trying, because she'll always win." The smile he gave her was reminiscent of their first couple of days of marriage, and she longed for the days right after she'd met him. She missed the man she'd first married, because he seemed to have disappeared from her. On their way home, she talked to him about making her chicken pot pie for supper. "I thought it would be a good thing to teach Marion how to make. And her husband said he'd love to go out on the range with you again." Doug nodded. "They're good people. I'm just ready to have my wife back in my house all the time." She frowned. "I thought it would be easier to teach Marion to cook on her own stove, the one she'd be using to prepare meals. If you'd rather I had her come to our house every day, I'd be happy to do that. Thank you for being willing, but it's all right. You're almost done, right?" "I'll be done teaching her by the end of this week." "Does that work?" She really hated that she was displeasing him by being gone, but helping others made her very happy. They'd figure it out eventually, she was certain. He nodded. "It does. I am still calving right now, so there's not much time I could spend with you anyway." "Would you want to spend time with me if you could?" she asked. She had no idea where the words came from, and she regretted them immediately. They made her sound downright pitiful. He looked at her in surprise. "Of course, I'd want to spend time with you. Do you think I don't like to be around you?" She shrugged. "I'm just not sure of my footing sometimes. Before the marches come over, we'll have to go up to the bedroom. I'll show you where I want you to be." She shook her head. "Oh, there's no doubt in my mind where my footing is in the bedroom. That should tell you what you need to know." He wasn't sure why his lovemaking didn't let her know how much he cared for her. And maybe it should, but Trudy wasn't convinced. Sure, she knew he liked to make love with her, but that was different than enjoying being around her when they were vertical. As soon as Marion and Thomas arrived, Thomas took a horse and went to find Doug, while Trudy taught Marion how to make a pie crust. Pie crusts are the hardest things to make, in my opinion, Trudy said. She showed Marion how to roll out the crust, and then Marion did the bulk of the work. "You'll show me how to make a cherry pie tomorrow?" she asked. "Your pie was the best thing at the potluck Sunday. The crust just melted in my mouth, and had a buttery taste. That's how it's supposed to be. And yes, I'll show you. This is the same crust, but we're making this into a savory pie, and that one was sweet. I like to add chicken, peas, and carrots in a white sauce. They all cook together, and we add them to the crust. Then we bake. It's pretty basic." As they worked together, Trudy thought about asking her friend what she did when Thomas got quiet, but she really didn't think she wanted to share her marital troubles. Not just yet. Perhaps the troubles were in her mind like Doug seemed to be telling her. After the chicken pot pie was in the oven, Trudy whipped up an easy cake recipe, showing her friend exactly what to do. "This is a coffee cake, usually meant for mornings, but I think it's a great dessert as well. I know Doug will be pleased to have a dessert of any kind." As usual, Trudy baked without a recipe, and Marion watched. "You'll write it down for me?" "Of course. I never mind writing anything down, but I've done so much cooking, I just don't need a lot of recipes anymore." When the men came in, Trudy removed the chicken pot pie and put the coffee cake into the oven. She always preferred to serve coffee cakes hot. As they sat down, Thomas smiled at Trudy. "I need to thank you for all the help you've been giving Marion. Even when you're not around, she cooks decent meals now. She hasn't burned even one thing since the two of you started working together. And my house is spotless now. I cannot believe the difference you've made." Trudy smiled. "It was my pleasure. It's fun to teach other people things like that. I've been cooking all my life, and she never had to. You can't expect someone to do something they've never learned." "I see that now." Doug said a quick prayer, and they ate together, the conversation kept up mostly by Marion and Trudy. "What else do you want Marion to be able to cook?" "I'm happy to show her anything, but I don't think she needs more than another week of instruction." "Stew," Thomas said quickly. "I've always loved a good venison stew." "Oh, sure. I can do that. I'll take my rifle out and get some meat, and then we'll cook it together. I'll even show her how to butcher her own deer." Trudy shrugged, not minding at all. Thomas looked at Doug with wide eyes. "Your wife hunts?" "My wife has hidden skills that even I haven't seen yet. She told me a story about shooting apples off her brother's heads with a slingshot." Marion looked at Trudy and laughed. "I've been sitting here admiring your womanly skills and wishing I was as domestic as you are, and here you can shoot your own deer?" Trudy shrugged. "It's all part of being a farm girl. I did whatever I was told at any given time. That's why I can climb a tree." Marion looked at Thomas. "You should have seen her yesterday. There was a cherry tree, and I was looking at it, trying to figure out how we were going to get cherries without a ladder, and the next thing I knew, she was perched on a branch plucking cherries like she did it every day." Thomas looked at Trudy. "Did your mother mind that you were such a tomboy?" "I'm not sure my mother even noticed." "Well, she noticed when I was shooting apples off my brother's heads and took my slingshot away, but for the most part, my brothers and sisters and I ran wild. We liked it that way, and it was easier for her. She didn't have to chase us so much." Thomas looked at Doug. "Do you mind?" "Mind? Why would I mind? I have a wife who's good at absolutely everything. It sounds like a dream come true. I just won't ever go shooting with her, because then I won't be able to tell her I can outshoot her any longer." Thomas seemed to be stunned, but he said nothing else. Marion smiled at Trudy. "I think she's wonderful. I love that she can teach me so many things. I'm glad Mrs. Goldman introduced us." I needed a good friend here who would make me stop missing my sisters. Are your sisters all as good at everything as you are? Marian asked. No. Some are good at some things and some at others. My sister Elizabeth is a businesswoman. My sister Susan is a rancher's wife in Texas. My sister Mary married the boy next door, and she is having babies and being a farm wife. We're all different. Doug ate his last bite of the chicken pot pie, and he smiled. She's the best cook around, and that's the only thing that matters to me. Thomas nodded. I suppose you should be very happy to have found this one to be your wife. Marian stayed and helped do the dishes, while the men sat at the table and talked. Doug was whittling, and Trudy listened to the conversation the men had. Doesn't your wife make you uncomfortable? Thomas asked. Why would she? Because she's so, well, manly. Manly? Have you seen my wife? She's one of the most beautiful women I've ever met. She cooks and bakes foods that melt in your mouth, they taste so good. How could I ever complain about that without sounding childish? Doug was proud of everything Trudy could do, whether others saw her skills as manly or womanly. I suppose. Thomas didn't sound convinced, and Trudy blinked away tears. She didn't like being talked about that way. Marian must have understood how she felt, because she said, What time will you come over tomorrow? Should I go hunting with you? Maybe you could teach me to shoot a rifle. Trudy smiled at her friend, understanding what she was doing. I'd love to take you hunting. The hard part with a deer is getting it home after you shoot it. That's more of something for a man to do. Women just don't have the same strength as men do. I suppose not, Marian said. I do wish I could shoot a deer and then fix it for a meal. Of course, I'm squeamish, and I might throw up the first time. Trudy laughed. It's just meat. I promise, when you think of it that way, it won't bother you at all. After the other couple left, Trudy went to sit with Doug. Do you feel like Thomas does? That I'm too manly? Doug laughed, taking her hand and pulling her onto his lap. It was the first affection he'd shown her outside the bedroom in over a week. You certainly don't feel manly. His hand went up and covered her breast. I think we should go to bed early tonight. We both have to be up early, and we want to have enough time to have a little fun. Fun, she asked, knowing perfectly well exactly what he wanted. Food and sex were the only things he ever wanted from her. Yes, fun. Trudy laughed and kissed him softly. You know, I think I like it when you want to have fun. She wiggled a little on his lap, just to feel his reaction. Race you. And she took off running toward the stairs, knowing he'd be right behind her. The sound of his laughter filled the air around them, and she smiled. She had so missed his laughter for the past days. It had seemed as if he'd never be happy again, which seemed ridiculous to her. When they got to the bedroom, they both stripped themselves quickly, jumping into bed together. Trudy had felt like he hadn't really seen her, and he was going through the motions as they made love. But that night was different. He took his time and kissed her everywhere, and when he finally joined his body with hers, it felt like a celebration. Every bit of his mind was with her, and when they were finished, he held her close, stroking her arms and her shoulders. Did I do all right? Trudy asked, determined that he was going to praise her after lovemaking at least once. Doug looked at her. Of course. I've never complained when we've made love. Why would she even ask that? Trudy decided that was as good as she was going to get, and she curled up beside him, yawning widely. Well, I think it was very nice. I enjoy being intimate with you. Maybe he'd be able to take instruction from her and give her the words she needed. Instead, he kissed her forehead and closed his eyes. Go to sleep. Mornings come way too early. Trudy sighed, wishing he would understand what she needed. It was all right though, because she had her entire life to teach him what he needed to know. They were married, and he wasn't going anywhere. As her eyes drifted closed, she wondered if he would ever love her like she loved him. She didn't know how or when it had happened, but all at once she knew she'd never make it without him. He was her everything. Chapter 9. When Trudy woke the next morning, she reached for Doug, hoping that their lovemaking the night before had healed their relationship, and they would once again be like they had been during the first few days of marriage. He wasn't there. She sighed, and sat up, reaching for her clothes, and going down to start breakfast. If she couldn't reach him any other way, she could always reach him with food, because it seemed to be his favorite thing in all the world. When she got downstairs, he wasn't there, but the milk pail and the egg basket were gone, so she was certain he was doing his morning chores. She did a quick meal of bacon, eggs, and toast, and it was ready when he got back inside. She put the plates on the table as he was washing his hands. "Coffee?" she asked. He drank it some mornings, and didn't others. "Yes." Doug sat down in front of his food while she poured coffee for both of them. After the prayer, she asked, "Why did you get up so early?" "I woke earlier than usual, and you were already gone." He shrugged. "Just woke up. I'm a little worried about the herd today, and I'm not sure why, but I've learned to trust my instincts in these things." Trudy nodded. "That makes sense. I made extra bacon for sandwiches for you today. Do you want 2 like usual? Or 3? Make it 3. I'm not sure what I'll find out there, and I know whatever it is, I'm going to need extra food to keep me going. Of course, I always seem to need extra food to keep me going." She laughed softly. "That's very true. Do you know what you want for supper tonight? I'm going to try to get a deer this morning, and I'm teaching Marion to make venison stew. How does that sound to you?" She knew he'd been at the table when they'd talked about it the previous night, but he hadn't participated in the conversation, and she truly wasn't certain if he was paying attention. He nodded. "Sounds good. You should know by now that if you make it, I'll eat it." After breakfast, she got his rifle and took the wagon over to Marion's. That way, if they didn't get a deer, they could at least go to the store in town and get provisions. Marion was waiting for her, and the 2 women went toward where they had seen deer on their walk on Saturday. "Do we need to be really quiet?" Marion asked. Trudy nodded. "It's best if they don't hear us coming." To her it was common sense, but obviously Marion had never been hunting, so she wouldn't know. Less than an hour later, Trudy took aim with the rifle and got a buck right through the heart. She handed the rifle to Marion, instructing her to keep the barrel raised, so there was no chance of shooting anyone. Trudy's father hadn't approved of her shooting guns, but he'd made sure she knew how to be safe when she did. The 2 women dragged the animal back to Marion's house, and they strung him up from a tree upside down as Trudy had been taught. She had learned to use a tree branch as leverage when hoisting an animal up. "We'll let it bleed out until after lunchtime, and then we'll butcher it for the meat." Marion shook her head. "I can't believe you know how to do all this." Trudy shrugged. "It really is the difference in our backgrounds. You were raised in New York City, and I was raised on a farm outside Beckham, Massachusetts. The skills we learned were very different, and they should have been." They'd talked a lot about how they'd been raised, so she knew where her friend had grown up. Marion nodded. "The closest I ever got to nature was Central Park, and it was surely a beautiful place, but hunting wasn't allowed there." "I would hope not. It would have been easy for someone without good aim to kill people that way. I'm sure it was much safer to just say no hunting there." "Did you enjoy Central Park?" Trudy had heard about the park all her life, and she'd always wondered if it was as wonderful as it was touted to be. "It was lovely. Truthfully, it was like an area with no civilization inside a huge city. I would rather be here than in Central Park, because there, I would be forced back to reality too quickly. Here, I can walk miles in any direction without running into a group of people." I like how quiet it is here. It was worse in Massachusetts because we were close to a large town. Here, I don't worry who will hear me if I shout at my husband. Marian giggled. Do you really shout at your husband? I haven't needed to so far. Trudy winked at her friend, and they went inside, leaving the deer hanging where it was. Let's talk about lunch. Any ideas? I have leftovers from what I made Saturday night. Lunch is taken care of then. Monday needs to be your laundry day. We did it last Monday, and it's time to do it again. We skipped the bed linens last week, but it's time to wash them now. Trudy rubbed the back of her neck. Next week, I'll need to conquer spring cleaning at my house. Would you like to come and help me with it, and then I'll help you with your spring cleaning the week after? I think it'll be more fun with both of us. She didn't look forward to going back to her days alone after spending so much time with her new friend. She'd gotten used to being with her every day. That sounds nice. If I bring food, will you help me make suppers? Marian looked as if she was afraid to ask after everything Trudy had done for her already. Sure. I don't mind that at all. Trudy wasn't sure how Doug would feel about the Marches eating with them, so she didn't offer for them to simply stay for supper every night. They did the laundry that day, and Trudy realized she was falling behind on her own laundry. I need to come after lunch tomorrow, if that's okay. I just realized that my laundry is behind. But you'll make enough for supper tonight to serve for lunch tomorrow, so you'll be fine without me. Marian nodded. Why do I think I need you here holding my hand every step of the way? Trudy smiled. I wish I could be. You're like my Colorado sister, and I'm thrilled you're here. We'll work together as much as we can. We'll have to sew together as well. She just needed to remember not to neglect her husband as she was helping her friend. I'd like that. When Trudy got home that afternoon, she put together a casserole and put it in the oven, before going outside to water her garden. There weren't any weeds popping up yet, but the dirt was dry, and she was worried her plants wouldn't grow without more rain. After watering, she went inside the house and gave herself a sponge bath standing in front of the sink. She needed a real bath, but with as much time as she was spending at the Marches' house, it would be difficult to get. Perhaps she could do it before lunch the following day. It would be good to have a mostly normal routine, if only for a day. When Doug came in, he sniffed appreciatively. What's for supper? It was always his first question when he walked in the door. He didn't much care about the answer, but he always liked to anticipate the coming feast. I made a casserole out of cornbread, corn, sausage, and some cheese. I think you're going to love it. She hoped he would anyway, because she'd made it up as she'd gone. Of course, she'd always had the ability to taste things as she imagined putting them together. She'd never failed. He smiled. You made it, so you know I'll love it. Did you find anything odd on the ranch today? I know you were worried. A coyote got in and killed another calf. One of the heifers. We're going to have to work on better fences. He rubbed his hands over his face, leaving a streak of dirt down one cheek. I'm sorry about the calf. She didn't mention the streak of dirt, because she really didn't mind. Stepping forward, Trudy walked to him and wrapped her arms around him. I know it's hard to face so many setbacks. We always know we'll lose a few calves, but we were doing so well, I thought we could make it through without losing any this year. I was wrong. His arms came around her, and he rested his cheek atop her head. Did you get a deer? We did. I'll make stew tomorrow night. I started thinking about what I made tonight a few days ago, and it sounded too good to put off making. She hoped he didn't care that she'd changed the plan for supper without consulting him. All right. He washed his hands and went to sit at the table, looking curiously at the food she put in front of him. This looks strange. But it smells amazing, which means it will be wonderful. She sat beside him and waited as he prayed. He seemed to be somewhere between when she'd first met him and the last few days with his temperament. It was better than it had been for certain. He took a bite and smiled. "This is delicious. I don't know how you always have everything coming out so perfectly." "I work hard at it." She thought for a moment and amended what she'd said. "I worked hard at learning to cook, but now that I know how, it's pretty simple to keep doing it. I just get bored cooking the same things over and over, so I'm always trying to find new recipes. Or make them up, as the case may be." After supper, she did the dishes, and he whittled again. She sat down and wrote a couple of letters as she did most nights. The curtains were done and hanging at the windows, but she still needed to finish the tablecloth. If he'd talked to her more, she'd sew as they were spending time together in the evenings instead of writing her letters, because she couldn't chat with him while writing letters. "Tomorrow, I'm not going to the Marches' house until after lunch, so if you want to come home at lunchtime, I'll fix something." Trudy knew he'd want her to cook for him. He'd made it clear he was sick of sandwiches. She wanted to think it was because he wanted to spend time with her, but she knew better. He wanted better food. "Is there enough of what we had for supper for you to warm up for tomorrow?" he asked. She nodded. "There is. I'll make sure it's hot when you come home at noon." "Why aren't you going in the morning?" he asked. "I need to do our laundry. I can take it down before cooking supper, but I need it on the line in the morning." "I see." Doug was again quiet after that, working on his whittling. She had no idea what he was making, but she was certain it would be pretty when he was done. He took such care with each stroke of his knife. Trudy finished her second letter, and she stood up, yawning and stretching. "I'm going to bed. I'm tired." He nodded. "I'll be up in a minute." Trudy went upstairs and undressed, not even bothering to put her nightgown on. Why would she when he would just take it off her anyway? When Doug got upstairs, he stripped and got under the covers, reaching for Trudy. Finding her naked was a welcome surprise, and he made slow sweet love to her. He still wasn't sure what he'd done in his life to find such a loving, caring woman to marry him, who could also cook, but he was thankful every day. He fell asleep with a slight smile on his lips, happy to be with his wife, and happy to be alive. Asterisk. As soon as Doug had left the following morning, Trudy began heating water. She'd decide to take a good long bath as soon as the clothes were on the line, and though she knew she'd run the risk of Doug coming home in the middle of her bath, she wasn't terribly worried about it. After the clothes were hanging, she put the leftover casserole into the oven to heat, and she climbed into the tub full of hot water. It felt so good to completely immerse herself. When she came up for air, she realized Doug was standing over her, a grin on his face. "You're welcome to bathe when I'm around. I seem to always come in when you're in the middle of it anyway." Trudy sighed, reaching for her towel. "I really tried to get done while you were out. You shouldn't be back for another 45 minutes or so." It was frustrating to always have her baths interrupted. They were her favorite thing in the world, and the only thing she'd ever really wanted to do alone. "Maybe not, but I'm here. I cut myself a little and wanted to get it washed before it got too dirty." He indicated a gash on his arm. She looked at the cut and decided it wasn't bad enough for stitches. "Wash it good, and I'll bandage it for you." She looked longingly at her bathtub, knowing she wouldn't have another chance for a bath for a few days. "You don't have to get out," he said with a frown. "I wasn't trying to interrupt. I want my hands dry when I bandage you." "It's fine." She dried off and went upstairs to put on a clean dress, and she'd washed the one she'd been wearing in her bathwater, which had been the plan all along. When she came back downstairs, he was sitting at the table, looking tired. He had injured himself on the inside of his arm, just above the wrist. She got an old, clean cloth and tore a strip from it, sitting beside him and carefully winding the bandage around his arm. Thank you, he said softly. You're welcome. She got up and removed their lunch from the oven, giving him a huge portion and herself a small one. I'm making venison stew for supper. She couldn't wait until he tried her stew. It was one of the best things she made. That sounds so good. Are you still spending the day at the Marches? He asked. Yes, Marion still needs me there watching her until she gets a little more confidence. It's hard for her to learn to cook. Why didn't her mother teach her? Doug asked. Isn't that a mother's job? He really couldn't understand why his wife was off teaching the neighbor to cook. I really don't think her mother knew how to cook, Trudy told him. She was raised in a well-off family in New York. They had servants, and there was never any need for Marion to learn. Doug stared at her for a moment. Is that why she needs help? Yes, it is. I know it seems strange to those of us who were raised under very different circumstances, but since I can help, I'm happy to do it. Do you know if Thomas was raised the same way? He seems to know how to work. Trudy shrugged. I really don't know, but I don't think so. He was annoyed with Marion for not being able to cook well and for burning everything, so I think he was probably raised more like we were. And she thought it was very sad that they were just now having this conversation instead of having had it when she first started helping the neighbors. I suppose it's all right that you're helping then. Have you been angry with me for it? She asked. Maybe that would account for some of his strange behavior, but it had started before she'd met the Marches, so that couldn't be it. He shook his head. Not really angry. I may have felt a little neglected, but that's something else entirely. I'm sorry I made you feel neglected. And now I'm going to run off again this afternoon. She wondered if she should stay home with him, since he'd injured himself. I understand better now. Go do what you need to do. I'll be all right. I'm heading back out to work anyway. Trudy gave him a questioning look. Are you sure? He nodded. All right. She put the dishes into the sink and ran water over them. She would wash them with the supper dishes in a few hours. I'll be back soon. She was very aware that he watched her leave, and she wished she knew what to say to him to get him to be open with her. Maybe there was nothing that would get him to be the man he'd seemed to be those first 2 days. This could be the real him, and the idea frightened her. She needed a man who would talk to her about day-to-day life. Trudy saddled a horse and headed over to her friend's house, thinking the entire way. She wanted to make Doug happy, but she just didn't know how. Chapter 10. By the end of the week, Doug had slipped back into barely talking to Trudy, and she was starting to worry that he was angry with her again. To see if she could figure out what was going on in his head, instead of going to the Marches' house on Saturday, she stayed home and did some housework, making a big meal for Doug. When he got home after his long day, he walked in and sniffed deeply, smelling the fresh bread that had just come from the oven and the smell of something sweet. Pie, he called as he walked into the kitchen. Trudy laughed. You don't even bother to greet me when you ask what I have cooking anymore. Maybe I should go back to Massachusetts, and you should find yourself an old woman to marry like you wanted at first. Doug stopped in his tracks and looked at Trudy. Is that what you want? She realized he'd taken her words literally, and she started to take them back, but they were long overdue for a serious discussion. It's not what I want, but I sometimes think it would make you happy. Why would you think that? He washed his hands and turned to her. I've been on my very best behavior. She frowned. You have? He nodded. I'm trying really hard to stay quiet for the most part, so you won't want to leave me. I have tried very hard not to be annoying. Everyone else in his life had left because of how annoying he was. He didn't want her to leave as well. Annoying? Doug, you've barely spoken to me in 2 weeks. How on earth could I find that annoying? And you don't want me to speak, right? It's better when I'm quiet and keep all my strange thoughts inside my head instead of sharing them with you. She shook her head adamantly. I want you to talk to me. I don't care if your thoughts are strange or not. They're your thoughts, and we should discuss them. Why would he think he had to hide his thoughts from her? He took a deep breath. My whole life, people have been annoyed by me. I was 3 when my mother left me at the orphanage, and I never knew why, but I think that's why. The matron told me almost daily that I needed to go and annoy someone else. I had a girl I was sweet on at school, and she told me to go away. He shrugged. I've been trying to be quiet so you wouldn't find me annoying and want me to go away like everyone else did. She shook her head. Doug, I'm going to find you annoying at times, but I'm not going to leave you because of it. Or ask you to go away. I love you, and I'll be by your side every day for the rest of our lives. Doug's eyes widened. You love me? Why? Trudy's heart broke for him, and she walked to him, wrapping both arms around him. I love you because you are a good man, and because my heart says you're the man I want to spend forever with. Who cares if I find you annoying at times? So, I don't have to act with you the way I act with everyone else? Quiet all the time. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Is that why people in town tell me you're quiet and don't talk to anyone? He nodded emphatically. I don't want people to realize how annoying I am and want me to leave. I can understand that, but I don't find you annoying. Well, you were a little annoying about food at first, but even in the beginning I was more attracted to you than annoyed by you. He sighed dramatically. Then I can really be me with you? And you'll accept everything about me, warts and all? Trudy laughed. I haven't noticed any warts, but if you grow some, then I'll accept them. Grinning, he lifted her off her feet for a moment until she was eye level with him. Marrying a woman who is good at everything is a little bit intimidating for a man like me. I was worried you'd run away, and I would lose the only woman that I'd ever love. Trudy smiled, feeling her heart soar in her chest with his words. You really love me? She asked. How could I do anything but? Ever since you threw that cherry at me, I knew I was in love with you. I always will be. Trudy kissed him, sighing contentedly. Well, I love you too, so I think we'll be happy. Now put me down or supper is going to burn, and we both know you won't live if you don't get food within the next 5 minutes. No, I won't. He grinned as he watched her scurry away to get his supper. She was definitely the woman he needed to spend the rest of his life with. Epilogue. Trudy worked picking the last of her vegetables in September, thankful that her friend Marion was there to help. She was expecting, and she was a little tired as she went about her daily chores, but she was happy. Happier than she'd ever dreamed she'd be. I can't believe we'll be delivering babies around the same time, Marion said. How are we going to be able to help each other? We'll both go to one house, and one can nap while the other works with the babies, and we'll take turns. We've learned how to work well together this summer, don't you think? Trudy asked. She loved the idea of her baby playing alongside Marion's. Sounds perfect to me. After she'd finished canning for the day, and Marion had gone home, Trudy put supper on the table, smiling at Doug. What are you grinning about? He asked. I'm just thinking how much I want the baby to look just like you. He needs to be a rancher like his father. She needs to be a cook, like her mother. Trudy sat down on Doug's lap and wrapped her arms around him. Hey, I'm hungry. She smiled. I'm just sitting here for a minute, loving my husband. Love me from over there, he said, pointing to the chair she usually sat in. When she stood to leave, he held her in place for a minute first. I love you very much. Life is just the way I imagined it would be. Perfect. Doug smiled, looking at Trudy and thinking the same thing. To him, life had been perfect since she'd arrived.